The emergency room lights flicker once, then steady. A woman in pale blue scrubs stands at a supply cart, counting bandages with slow, exact movements. Nobody looks at her twice. She has worked the night shift for 3 years. Nobody remembers her first name. Outside, tires stop hard on wet asphalt. Doors slam too many at once, too disciplined for panic. Boots move in formation across the parking lot, not the scattered rush of a normal emergency. The automatic doors part. 4 men in unmarked tactical gear step into the fluorescent light, rain still dripping from their jackets. The lead officer's eyes move past the doctors, past the charge nurse, past security, and land on the woman with the bandages. He says one word, quiet enough that only she hears it. Viper. Her hands stop moving. For 3 years, this hospital thought it knew exactly who she was. They were wrong. The clock above the nurse's station read 11:47 p.m. when Elena Cross began her final supply count of the night. She moved down the row of steel cabinets in Bay 4, checking gauze, saline bags, suture kits, each item logged in the same unhurried rhythm she used every shift. Her scrubs were pale blue, slightly faded from repeated washing. Her hair was pulled back tight, no loose strands, no jewelry, nothing that could catch or snag or be grabbed. Nobody had ever asked her why she dressed that way. Nobody had ever noticed enough to ask. Riverside General's emergency department at midnight was a place of controlled noise. Monitors beeping in overlapping rhythms, a radio murmuring low from the break room, the distant clatter of a gurney being wheeled into imaging. Elena's world lived inside all of it and somehow separate from it, the way a shadow exists inside a room without being part of the furniture. She had worked this floor for 3 years. In that time, she had trained 2 rotations of residents, covered 400 night shifts, and delivered more bad news to families than she had ever counted. She did her job with a precision that occasionally drew comment. She's fast, someone would say, or she never panics. But precision alone did not draw suspicion in a hospital. Hospitals were full of people who had learned to move fast and stay calm. It was, after all, the job. What nobody noticed, because nobody had reason to look for it, was the particular kind of calm Elena carried. It was not the calm of someone who had simply gotten used to blood and chaos. It was the calm of someone who had once been trained to expect worse than blood and chaos, and had never fully unlearned the habit of watching for it. She finished the gauze count and moved to the exit nearest the ambulance bay, checking, as she always did, without thinking about it, that the door was unlocked and unobstructed. Then she checked the second exit, the stairwell by radiology. Then the window latch in the supply room, though nothing about a window latch should have mattered to a nurse restocking bandages. It took 11 seconds. She had done it so many times it no longer registered as a decision. Cross. She turned. Dr. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, chart in hand, the kind of tired, irritated expression he wore most nights after 11. He was 31, 2 years out of residency, sharp in the classroom sense and still finding his footing in the sense that mattered on a floor like this. Bed 6 needs vitals redone. Families asking questions I don't have time for. He said it the way he said most things to her, not unkind, but absent, the tone of a man speaking to someone whose job was to be useful and little else. Can you handle that? I can handle that, Elena said. He was already walking away before she finished the sentence, his attention moving to the next problem, the next chart, the next fire needing a hand. It did not offend her. She had long since stopped expecting people to look twice at a nurse in a hallway. That was, in its own way, useful. Bed 6 held a 78-year-old man named Arthur Kell, admitted for chest pain that had turned out to be a manageable arrhythmia. His daughter sat beside him, hands twisted together, asking the same 3 questions in different words. Elena took his vitals, blood pressure steady, pulse regular, oxygen fine, and answered the daughter's questions without rushing, without checking the clock, without letting the woman feel like a burden on a busy night. She had a way of making 5 minutes feel unhurried even when the department behind her was anything but. You're very patient, the daughter said, quieter now, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. He's doing well, Elena said. That helps. It was a small moment. Nothing about it mattered to the wider story of the night. But it was, in its way, a demonstration, one of 100 she performed without anyone cataloging them, of a discipline that ran deeper than nursing school taught. She did not simply calm patients. She read them, the daughter's clenched hands, the shallow breath, the way she kept glancing at the door instead of her father. Elena had adjusted her voice accordingly, dropped it half a register, slowed her own movements to signal there is no emergency here without ever saying the words. It was the same skill that let her walk into a trauma bay mid-chaos and, within seconds, identify which patient's fear was making things worse and which patient's silence meant something had gone dangerously quiet inside them. Nobody on this floor had trained her to read a room like that. Somewhere else had. At 1:15 a.m., a young resident named Priya Anand caught up with her at the medication cart, restocking trays for the morning shift. "Can I ask you something?" Priya said. She was still new enough to ask questions other residents had learned to swallow. "Go ahead." "How do you stay so?" Priya searched for the word. "Still. Even when it's bad in there. Dr. Webb was losing it over the GSW last week, and you just kept working. Like it was nothing." Elena did not look up from the trays she was organizing. "It wasn't nothing. It just wasn't the first bad night I've had." "How many bad nights have you had?" A pause, brief enough that Priya likely didn't register it as a pause at all. Enough that this one didn't surprise me. It was, technically, the truth. It was also the kind of answer that closed a door without seeming to close it, vague enough to satisfy curiosity, specific enough to sound honest. Elena had given some version of that answer more times than she could count, to nurses, to doctors, to the rare patient sharp enough to notice that something about her competence didn't quite match her job title. Nobody had ever pushed further. People rarely did, when the answer sounded reasonable and the person delivering it seemed entirely unremarkable. That was the point. Unremarkable was not an accident. Unremarkable was maintained, daily, the way some people maintained a garden, small corrections, constant attention, nothing ever allowed to grow tall enough to be noticed from a distance. At 2:40 a.m., the department went quiet in the way EDs sometimes did, a lull between crises, the kind of silent staff learned not to trust completely. Elena used it to walk the perimeter of the floor one more time, checking supply levels, checking the medroom lock, checking, again, without conscious thought, the sight lines from the nurses' station to both entrances. She paused near the ambulance bay doors and looked out at the parking lot. Rain had started sometime in the last hour. The clock above the nurses' station read 11:47 p.m. when Elena Cross began her final supply count of the night. She moved down the row of steel cabinets in Bay 4, checking gauze, saline bags, suture kits, each item logged in the same unhurried rhythm she used every shift. Her scrubs were pale blue, slightly faded from repeated washing. Her hair was pulled back tight, no loose strands, no jewelry, nothing that could catch or snag or be grabbed. Nobody had ever asked her why she dressed that way. Nobody had ever noticed enough to ask. Riverside General's emergency department at midnight was a place of controlled noise. Monitors beeping in overlapping rhythms, a radio murmuring low from the break room, the distant clatter of a gurney being wheeled into imaging. Elena's world lived inside all of it and somehow separate from it, the way a shadow exists inside a room without being part of the furniture. She had worked this floor for 3 years. In that time, she had trained 2 rotations of residents, covered 400 night shifts, and delivered more bad news to families than she had ever counted. She did her job with a precision that occasionally drew comment. She's fast, someone would say, or she never panics. But precision alone did not draw suspicion in a hospital. Hospitals were full of people who had learned to move fast and stay calm. It was, after all, the job. What nobody noticed, because nobody had reason to look for it, was the particular kind of calm Elena carried. It was not the calm of someone who had simply gotten used to blood and chaos. It was the calm of someone who had once been trained to expect worse than blood and chaos, and had never fully unlearned the habit of watching for it. She finished the gauze count and moved to the exit nearest the ambulance bay, checking, as she always did, without thinking about it, that the door was unlocked and unobstructed. Then she checked the second exit, the stairwell by radiology. Then the window latch in the supply room, though nothing about a window latch should have mattered to a nurse restocking bandages. It took 11 seconds. She had done it so many times it no longer registered as a decision. Cross. She turned. Dr. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, chart in hand, the kind of tired, irritated expression he wore most nights after 11. He was 31, 2 years out of residency, sharp in the classroom sense and still finding his footing in the sense that mattered on a floor like this. Bed 6 needs vitals redone. Families asking questions I don't have time for. He said it the way he said most things to her, not unkind, but absent, the tone of a man speaking to someone whose job was to be useful and little else. "Can you handle that?" "I can handle that," Elena said. He was already walking away before she finished the sentence, his attention moving to the next problem, the next chart, the next fire needing a hand. It did not offend her. She had long since stopped expecting people to look twice at a nurse in a hallway. That was, in its own way, useful. Bed 6 held a 78-year-old man named Arthur Kell, admitted for chest pain that had turned out to be a manageable arrhythmia. His daughter sat beside him, hands twisted together, asking the same 3 questions in different words. Elena took his vitals, blood pressure steady, pulse regular, oxygen fine, and answered the daughter's questions without rushing, without checking the clock, without letting the woman feel like a burden on a busy night. She had a way of making 5 minutes feel unhurried even when the department behind her was anything but. "You're very patient," the daughter said, quieter now, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "He's doing well," Elena said. "That helps." It was a small moment. Nothing about it mattered to the wider story of the night. But it was, in its way, a demonstration, one of 100 she performed without anyone cataloging them, of a discipline that ran deeper than nursing school taught. She did not simply calm patients. She read them, the daughter's clenched hands, the shallow breath, the way she kept glancing at the door instead of her father. Elena had adjusted her voice accordingly, dropped it half a register, slowed her own movements to signal there is no emergency here without ever saying the words. It was the same skill that let her walk into a trauma bay mid-chaos and, within seconds, identify which patient's fear was making things worse and which patient's silence meant something had gone dangerously quiet inside them. Nobody on this floor had trained her to read a room like that. Somewhere else had. At 1:15 a.m., a young resident named Priya Anand caught up with her at the medication cart, restocking trays for the morning shift. "Can I ask you something?" Priya said. She was still new enough to ask questions other residents had learned to swallow. "Go ahead." "How do you stay so?" Priya searched for the word. "Still. Even when it's bad in there. Dr. Webb was losing it over the GSW last week, and you just kept working. Like it was nothing." Elena did not look up from the trays she was organizing. "It wasn't nothing. It just wasn't the first bad night I've had." "How many bad nights have you had?" A pause, brief enough that Priya likely didn't register it as a pause at all. Enough that this one didn't surprise me. It was, technically, the truth. It was also the kind of answer that closed a door without seeming to close it, vague enough to satisfy curiosity, specific enough to sound honest. Elena had given some version of that answer more times than she could count, to nurses, to doctors, to the rare patient sharp enough to notice that something about her competence didn't quite match her job title. Nobody had ever pushed further. People rarely did, when the answer sounded reasonable and the person delivering it seemed entirely unremarkable. That was the point. Unremarkable was not an accident. Unremarkable was maintained, daily, the way some people maintained a garden, small corrections, constant attention, nothing ever allowed to grow tall enough to be noticed from a distance. At 2:40 a.m., the department went quiet in the way EDs sometimes did, a lull between crises, the kind of silent staff learned not to trust completely. Elena used it to walk the perimeter of the floor one more time, checking supply levels, checking the medroom lock, checking, again, without conscious thought, the sight lines from the nurse's station to both entrances. She paused near the ambulance bay doors and looked out at the parking lot. Rain had started sometime in the last hour, fine and steady under the security lights. Nothing moved out there except the rain itself. She stood a moment longer than the task required. It was a habit she had never fully explained to herself, not anymore. This small ritual of watching an empty lot as though it might, on some ordinary Tuesday night, stop being empty. 3 years of nothing happening had not worn the habit down. If anything, 3 years of quiet had sharpened it, the way stillness sometimes sharpens a person's ear for the first sound that doesn't belong. Behind her, a monitor alarm chirped once and resolved itself. Someone laughed quietly in the break room. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary night. Elena turned from the window and walked back toward the nurse's station, her footsteps even, unhurried, indistinguishable from anyone else's on the floor. Nobody watching her would have guessed that the woman restocking bandage trays had once been trained to survive things this hospital's entire staff, working together, would not have known how to name. Nobody was watching. That was, for now, exactly how she needed it to stay. The clock read 3:02 a.m. 4 hours left in her shift. She had no way of knowing yet that this would be the last ordinary night this hospital would have for a long time. The ambulance call came in at 4:52 a.m., flagged as a single vehicle accident on Route 9, male patient, mid-30s, conscious, multiple lacerations. By the time the doors opened and the gurney rolled through, Elena was already at the intake position, gloves on, eyes moving across the patient with the fast, practiced sweep she gave every trauma case. Paramedic Danny Ruiz called out vitals as they moved, BP stable, pulse elevated, GCS 15, the standard cadence of a routine handoff. Except it wasn't routine. Elena saw that within 4 seconds. The lacerations across the man's forearms were clean, parallel, evenly spaced, not the ragged tearing of glass or metal from a car accident. His knuckles were split and swollen in a pattern she recognized instantly. Impact injuries, the kind that came from repeated contact with something solid and unyielding. A face, a wall, a jaw. Not a steering wheel. Single vehicle rollover, Ruiz said again, reading from his notes rather than looking at the patient. Found him on the shoulder near the guardrail. Any airbag deployment? Elena asked. Ruiz blinked. Didn't check. No bruising pattern for it, Elena said, already moving the man's arm gently to check rotation. No sternal contusion, no seatbelt marking. She kept her voice level, clinical, the tone of someone simply narrating findings for the chart. This isn't accident trauma. Dr. Webb, arriving mid-sentence the way he always did, glanced at the chart without slowing down. Doesn't matter what caused it, Cross. Let's get him stabilized and worry about the story later. It was a reasonable thing to say. It was also, Elena thought, exactly the kind of thing that let a story slip past unquestioned in a busy ED at 5 in the morning. She didn't argue. She simply logged the observation in her own memory, the way she logged everything that didn't add up, filing it in a place separate from the chart. The patient, his intake bracelet read John Doe, unconfirmed, watched her with a stillness that didn't match a man supposedly injured in a car crash 40 minutes earlier. His eyes tracked the room the way hers did. Exits. Staff positions. The location of the security camera mounted near the triage desk. Elena noticed him noticing. She said nothing. She finished dressing his wounds with the same unhurried care she gave every patient, and if her hands lingered a half-second longer than necessary near his wrist, checking not just circulation but the faint ring of bruising that suggested he'd recently worn something removed in a hurry, a watch, a bracelet, a restraint, nobody in the room clocked it as anything but thoroughness. "You're good at this," the man said quietly, when Webb had moved to the next bed and Priya was occupied at the supply cart. "It's the job," Elena said. His eyes held hers a beat longer than comfortable conversation required. "Not everyone's this careful." She met his gaze without giving him anything. "Everyone should be." He didn't answer. A moment later he closed his eyes, and whatever had passed between them folded itself back beneath the ordinary surface of a busy shift. At 5:30 a.m., Elena stepped into the staff corridor behind the supply room, phone in hand, and dialed a number that did not appear anywhere in her contacts list. It rang once. "It's me," she said, voice dropped low, flattened into something that carried none of the warmth she used with patients. "I need a name run. Male, mid-30s, admitted under John Doe. Injury patterns inconsistent with the story he gave EMS." A pause. "No, not yet. I want to know before I decide that." She listened for 11 seconds, her expression unreadable, eyes fixed on a point on the wall that wasn't really there. "Understood," she said, and ended the call. When she stepped back into the hallway, Priya was walking past with a tray of blood draws, and slowed just slightly. "Everything okay? You look, I don't know, different." "Long night," Elena said, already resuming her usual pace, her usual expression. "Aren't they all?" Priya laughed, accepting it, and moved on. It was, Elena had learned long ago, remarkably easy to explain away a strange moment with a tired shrug and a familiar cliché. People wanted the mundane explanation. It cost them less. The rest of the pre-dawn hours moved with the ordinary texture of hospital time. A fall patient from a nursing home, a child with a fever that frightened her parents more than it should have, the low hum of machines and voices that made up the background of Elena's entire professional life. She worked through it the way she always did, present and competent and, to anyone glancing her way, entirely unremarkable. But something in her had shifted register, the way a radio operator's ear sharpens the instant static changes pitch. She found herself checking the ambulance bay window twice more before shift's end, though nothing outside had changed. She found herself positioning near John Doe's bed more often than his chart strictly required, close enough to hear if his breathing changed, close enough to see if anyone came asking for him who shouldn't. At 6:15, a hospital administrator named Grant Feld, mid-50s, always slightly too pleased with his own authority, stopped by intake with a clipboard, frowning at the John Doe file. No ID, no insurance, no next of kin, Feld said, more to himself than to anyone. We'll need police to run prints once he's stable. Can't have an unidentified male sitting in my ED all day. Understood, Elena said. You seem awfully interested in this one, Cross. Feld said it lightly, the way a man says something he doesn't actually mean as a question. He's a patient, Elena said. I'm interested in all of them. Feld gave a short laugh and moved on, already forgetting the exchange. It was, Elena thought, the great advantage of a hospital hierarchy. Administrators rarely looked twice at a nurse's attention to a chart. Attention was, after all, what nurses were for. At 6:40 a.m., her phone buzzed once in her pocket. A single text, no name attached, 3 words long, call not safe. Elena's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. She glanced toward bed 6A, where the man calling himself John Doe lay with his eyes closed, breathing slow and even, too even, she thought now, for someone genuinely asleep. She did not react beyond that glance. She finished charting a discharge 2 beds down, spoke gently to an elderly patient about follow-up care, smiled at a nervous new father pacing near the vending machines. To every eye in that department, Elena Cross was exactly who she had been for 3 years. Quiet, competent, unremarkable. But somewhere behind that calm surface, a door that had stayed shut for a long time had opened half an inch, and she could feel cold air moving through the gap. Whatever the man in bed 6A actually was, and she had 3 years of instinct telling her it wasn't car accident victim, someone out there did not want a phone call made about him. That meant someone out there already knew he was here. Which meant, whatever this was, it had already started before she'd noticed the first crack in the story. Elena finished her shift at 7 a.m. exactly, handing off her patients to the day nurse with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to every report. Nothing in her voice suggested urgency. Nothing in her face suggested that she intended to sit in her car in the hospital parking lot for the next 40 minutes, watching the ambulance bay doors, waiting to see who came asking about a man with knuckle injuries and a stranger's stillness in his eyes. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn. The lot was quiet, ordinary, gray with early light. Elena watched it anyway. 3 years of nothing happening had taught this hospital that she was harmless. It had taught her, in that same time, exactly how quickly nothing could become something. Elena did not go home. She sat in her car at the far edge of the staff lot, engine off, watching the ambulance bay through a windshield beaded with the last of the night's rain. Shift change traffic moved around her, nurses leaving, nurses arriving, the ordinary tide of a hospital resetting itself for daylight. Nobody paid attention to a parked car with a tired-looking woman inside. Tired women in parked cars were, in a hospital lot at 7 in the morning, part of the scenery. At 7:38, 3 black SUVs turned off the main road and entered the lot in tight formation, moving with a discipline that had nothing to do with civilian driving habits. No horns, no hesitation at the turn, no jostling for the closest space. They parked in a line facing the exit, a detail Elena's eyes caught and filed automatically. Ready to leave fast, if it comes to that. She did not start her engine. She did not move at all. 8 men stepped out. Their clothing was deliberately plain, dark jackets, no insignia, no visible weapons. But Elena had spent enough of her old life around men like this to read past the costume. It was in how they exited the vehicles, doors opening in sequence rather than all at once, each man's eyes sweeping a different arc of the lot before any of them committed to walking. It was in their stride, even and unhurried, the gait of people who had been trained not to look rushed even when everything in them wanted to run. Not law enforcement, she thought. Not private security. Military. Task force, most likely joint command. And they are not here for a routine matter. A 9th man stepped out last, from the middle vehicle. Older, gray at the temples, wearing a plain gray suit instead of tactical clothing, though he moved with the same economy as the others. He didn't hurry either. He didn't need to. Everyone else moved to accommodate his pace. Elena watched him cross the lot toward the main entrance, and something in her chest went very still and very cold. She knew that walk. She hadn't seen it in 3 years. She had hoped, in some buried, rarely visited part of herself, that she would never see it again. Inside, the morning shift was 3 hours into its rhythm when the gray-suited man and 2 of his escort entered through the main doors. Grant Feld intercepted them almost immediately, clipboard in hand, the reflexive territorial instinct of an administrator meeting an unscheduled visitor. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The older man produced a folded set of credentials, held them up just long enough for Feld to register the seal, but not long enough to read every line. "Colonel Marcus Hale, Joint Special Operations Command. I need to speak with whoever's overseeing an unidentified male patient admitted early this morning. Trauma intake, approximately 5 a.m. Feld's professional composure faltered for half a second. I'd need to check with. Is there a warrant, or... There's a federal directive, Hale said, calm, unhurried, sliding a single sheet of paper across the counter. Classified designation. You're welcome to call the number on the letterhead to confirm, but I'd ask you to do it quickly. Every minute this takes is a minute we don't have." Feld read the paper twice, his mouth tightening. Whatever was printed there, it was enough to drain the argument out of him. Let me get the charge physician. Please." Word moved through the department the way word always did in a hospital, not through announcement, but through the sudden, subtle shift in everyone's posture. Nurses exchanged glances. A tech near imaging texted someone with visible urgency. By the time Dr. Webb arrived, jaw set, clearly unhappy at being summoned mid-round, half the floor already knew that men in dark jackets were standing in the lobby and nobody had explained why. Elena, who had slipped back into the building through the staff entrance 11 minutes earlier, badge in hand, expression arranged into the mild curiosity of someone returning for a forgotten bag, stood near the medroom doorway and watched Colonel Hale from a distance of perhaps 30 feet. He had not seen her yet. She intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. "The patient's stable," Webb was saying, arms crossed, doing his best impression of a man in control of his department. "We don't have an ID. He hasn't said a word about who he is or what happened. If this is a security matter, I need to understand why my ER is suddenly full of federal." "Doctor," Hale said, not unkindly, "I understand this is disruptive. I'm not able to give you the full picture, and I'm sorry for that. What I can tell you is that the man in bed 6A is connected to a matter of national security, that he is not, in fact, a car accident victim, and that until my team has assessed the situation, I need this floor's cooperation and I need it now." "You want me to just hand over a patient to—" "I want to see him," Hale said. "Not remove him. Not yet. See him, speak with your staff about his condition, and determine next steps. That's all I'm asking this morning." Webb glanced toward the nurse's station, some instinct pulling his eyes there before his brain caught up to why. "Fine. Cross can walk you through his chart." She took his intake. It was, Elena would think later, a small and entirely unremarkable sentence, the kind of thing a tired attending says 40 times a shift, delegating a task to the nurse who happens to know the file best. Webb had no idea what he'd just done. Colonel Hale turned toward the nurse's station. For 3 full seconds, across 30 feet of hospital floor, his eyes found Elena's and stopped. Something crossed his face, not shock exactly, because men like Hale had trained themselves out of visible shock decades ago, but a recalibration, quick and total, the look of a man rewriting an assumption in real time. His gaze moved once, briefly, across her scrubs, her badge, her tied-back hair, and then returned to her face. Elena held his eyes and gave him exactly nothing. No recognition. No alarm. The same mild, professional attentiveness she would offer any stranger who'd just been pointed in her direction. It was, she knew, not going to be enough. Not with him. Hale had not survived 3 decades in his line of work by trusting the first impression a room offered him, and the first impression Elena Cross offered, competent night nurse, unremarkable, thoroughly ordinary, was one he now had every reason to distrust. "Ms. Cross," he said, crossing the distance between them with unhurried steps. "I understand you took the intake on our patient this morning." "I did," Elena said. Her voice was steady, professionally warm, exactly as it would be for any visiting specialist asking about a chart. Is there somewhere you'd like to review it? Somewhere private would be helpful. A pause, brief, deliberate. If you have a few minutes. Of course. She led him toward the small consultation room off the main corridor, aware of Priya's curious glance, aware of Webb's irritated one, aware most of all of the two men in dark jackets who fell into step a respectful distance behind their colonel, close enough to intervene, far enough to seem like nothing more than an escort. Elena opened the consultation room door and stepped inside. Colonel Hale followed and closed it behind them both. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was small, windowless, the kind of space designed for delivering bad news to families in privacy. It felt, now, like something else entirely, a space suddenly charged with 3 years of silence about to break. Hale studied her face for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register that carried none of the polished authority he'd used in the lobby. It was quieter, almost careful. "You've done a very good job disappearing," he said. "I'll give you that." Elena said nothing. Her expression did not change. But behind it, something old and long buried had begun, very quietly, to wake up. "You have the wrong person," Elena said. It was, she knew even as she said it, a weak opening, the kind of line a guilty person offers by reflex before they've had time to build something better. Colonel Hale's expression didn't change, which told her he'd expected exactly that response and had already discounted it. "Elena Marie Cross," he said, quietly, like a man reading names off a headstone. "Born in Millbrook, Ohio. Enlisted at 19. Selected for a program that, officially, doesn't have a name, and unofficially, the 7 people who ever knew about it called Viper." He let that sit in the small room for a moment. "You were declared administratively separated 4 years ago. Medical discharge, the paperwork says. I signed off on some of that paperwork myself, Sergeant." "I'm not. You checked both exits in this room before you closed the door," Hale said, not unkindly, more like a man noting a fact than scoring a point. "You positioned yourself so you're not directly in front of the window, in case anyone's watching from the parking structure across the street. You've done all of that in the last 40 seconds, without looking like you were doing any of it." A faint, tired almost smile. "I could stand here and let you keep denying it, if that's what you need. But I don't have the time, and honestly, neither do you." Elena held his gaze for a long moment, weighing the cost of continuing to lie against the cost of admitting anything at all. 3 years of careful invisibility sat behind her like a wall she had built brick by brick, and Hale had just walked in and put his hand flat against it, testing whether it would hold. It did not hold. Not with him. Not after everything they had once been to each other in a different life. Commanding officer and operator, 2 people who had trusted each other with decisions that got people killed or kept them alive, decisions with no room for lies between them. "How did you find me?" she said finally. "Not if." "Oh. We didn't," Hale said. "Not on purpose. The man in bed 6A is an asset of ours, an informant embedded 18 months deep in a trafficking network that's been moving something considerably worse than people through 3 states. He went dark 11 hours ago. When we picked up his location this morning, it happened to be your emergency room." A pause. "I promise you, Elena, nobody at the Pentagon woke up this morning looking for you. You found us. Or we found each other. However you want to say it." Elena absorbed that. Her mind, despite 3 years of trying to quiet it, was already running the calculation Hale's information demanded. Trafficking network, informant burned or exposed, 11 hours dark, a man with fresh impact injuries and no story that matched his wounds. "He wasn't in a car accident," she said. "No. Someone worked him over and dumped him near a road so it would look like one. That's our read too. And whoever did that," Elena said slowly, "knows he's alive. Which means they'll come looking for him. Here." Hale's silence was answer enough. "You need to move him," Elena said, some old cadence returning to her voice without her permission. Flatter, faster, the voice of a person accustomed to giving assessments that mattered. "Not later today. If his network has any surveillance on hospitals in a 50-mile radius of where you found him, and given the scale you're describing, I'd assume they do, you have a window measured in hours, not days." "We're working on transport," Hale said. "It's not that simple. He's stable but not cleared to move, per your own doctor's assessment 20 minutes ago. And we can't exactly roll a military transport team through your lobby without drawing exactly the kind of attention we're trying to avoid." "Then you're stuck," Elena said. "A patient too fragile to move and too exposed to leave." "That's the situation, yes." They looked at each other. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with rank or history. The shared, silent recognition of two professionals staring at the same bad math and arriving at the same uncomfortable place. "I want you to understand something," Hale said, his voice softening slightly. "I am not here to pull you back into anything. Whatever reason you had for walking away, and I have my guesses, Elena, I was there for some of it, that's yours. I respect it. I came here for an asset, not for you. But now that I'm looking at you standing in this hospital, I have to ask." He hesitated, and for the first time since he'd walked in, something almost apologetic crossed his face. "Will you help me keep him alive for the next 12 hours? Not as Viper. As whatever you are now. I'm not ordering anything. I'm asking." The question hung in the small room like something with physical weight. Elena thought of the daughter in bed 6, hands twisted together, grateful for 5 unhurried minutes. She thought of Priya's easy trust, the way the department had absorbed her into its rhythm without ever asking the questions that would have unraveled everything. She thought of 3 years spent building a life defined by the absence of exactly this kind of choice. She also thought of the man in bed 6A, breathing too evenly for a man supposedly asleep, watching exits the way she did, alone in a room full of people who had no idea what was coming for him. "I'm not putting this hospital at risk," she said. "Not the staff, not the other patients. If I help, it's on those terms." "Those are my terms too," Hale said. "And when this is over, you don't know where I am. This didn't happen." A long pause. Then, quietly, "Understood." Elena exhaled, slow and controlled, the way she had once been taught to release tension before a decision that couldn't be walked back. 3 years of careful ordinariness sat behind her, and she felt, in this moment, the particular grief of watching something she'd built with great care begin to come apart. Not shattered, not yet, but cracked in a way that would never fully seal again. "Tell me what you actually know about who did this to him," she said. "All of it. Don't manage me, Colonel. Not anymore." Something that might have been relief, or might have been regret, moved briefly across Hale's face. "His name's on file as Ray Doss," he said. 18 months inside an organization we've been calling Meridian. We don't know exactly what tipped them to him, but based on the injuries, they wanted information before they decided whether to kill him. The fact that he's alive and dumped near a road instead of buried somewhere tells me one of two things. Either they wanted him found, as a message, or he got away from them before they finished the job. Which do you think it is? Hale's jaw tightened. I think it's the second one. Which means whoever did this to him is currently very unhappy that their message got interrupted, and they will absolutely want to finish delivering it. Elena looked toward the closed door, beyond which her ordinary hospital continued its ordinary Tuesday. Patients, charts, the low hum of machines, Priya's easy laugh somewhere down the hall. Then we don't have 12 hours, she said quietly. We have however long it takes them to realize where he ended up. Hale met her eyes, and in them she saw the same calculation she was running herself. Old instincts, dormant but never dead, recalibrating fast around a threat that had just walked, uninvited, into the only life she had left. Welcome back, Sergeant, he said quietly. I wish it were under better circumstances. So do I, Elena said, and meant it more than she expected to. By 9:15 a.m., Elena had returned to the floor in her scrubs, badge clipped back on, moving through the department as though the last 40 minutes hadn't happened. Nobody watching her would have guessed anything had changed. That was, she understood now more than ever, the entire skill of the thing, carrying a shift in the ground beneath you without letting your face show the tremor. Inside, everything had changed. She walked the department differently now, though the difference would have been invisible to anyone without her training. Her eyes swept the ambulance bay every time she passed a window, not out of habit anymore, but out of purpose. She noted which staff were on shift and which had already left. She noted that the security guard stationed near the main doors, a heavy-set man named Dale who spent most mornings on his phone, had not been briefed on anything and would be useless if trouble came through those doors fast. She noted, too, that Colonel Hale's men had positioned themselves with reasonable competence, one near the main entrance, one near the ambulance bay, Hale himself remaining in the consultation room, coordinating with a laptop and a secure line. It was a defensible perimeter, for men working with limited notice in an unfamiliar building. It was not, in Elena's assessment, enough. She found Hale alone, the door cracked, and stepped inside without knocking. "Your men are covering doors," she said. "They're not covering approach." Hale looked up from his laptop. Meaning if Meridian sends people, they won't walk in the front entrance wearing signs. They'll come in as visitors, as delivery, as someone's cousin here to see a patient. Your men are watching for an assault team. You need someone watching for a woman with a diaper bag and a face nobody would look at twice. She paused. Someone like me. Hale studied her for a moment. You want to run counter-surveillance. In your own hospital. On a shift you're not even scheduled for. I called in an extra shift 20 minutes ago, Elena said. Told the charge nurse we're short-staffed after the incident this morning, which we are, since half the department can't stop talking about the men in suits in the lobby. Nobody questioned it. I have a badge, a reason to be everywhere in this building, and 3 years of knowing every hallway, every camera blind spot, and every door that sticks when you push it. She let that settle. You have 8 men who'll get made in about 10 minutes by anyone doing real reconnaissance. I have 1 nurse nobody will ever suspect. It was, she recognized even as she said it, the first time in 3 years she had described herself in those terms out loud. Not as Elena the nurse, competent and kind and unremarkable, but as an asset, a tool built for exactly this kind of work. The word tasted strange in her mouth. It also, uncomfortably, fit. Hale exhaled slowly. Ground rules. You observe. You report. You do not engage unless there is no other option and lives are at immediate risk. This is not a mission, Elena. This is a favor between 2 people who used to trust each other completely. I need you to still be a nurse when this is over. I intend to be, Elena said. That's exactly why I'm doing it this way. She spent the next 2 hours doing what she did best, being nowhere and everywhere at once. She walked the lobby under the excuse of retrieving supplies, cataloging faces without ever seeming to look at anyone directly. She checked the visitor log at the front desk twice, comparing names against a mental list of nothing in particular, simply building a baseline of what normal looked like on an ordinary Tuesday so that anything abnormal would stand out against it. She spoke with a parking attendant, a friendly older man named Otis, under the pretense of asking about a coworker's car trouble, and in the process learned that a gray sedan had circled the lot twice in the last half hour without parking. The kind of detail Otis mentioned only because Elena had asked exactly the right small question in exactly the right idle tone. She relayed it to Hale from a supply closet, phone pressed low against her hip, voice barely above a whisper. Gray sedan, circled twice, no plates visible from where Otis was standing. Could be nothing. Could be someone confirming Ray's still here before they decide next steps. Copy, Hale said. I'll flag it. Colonel. She hesitated, something in her chest tightening around what she was about to say. If Meridian is patient enough to run reconnaissance instead of just storming the building, that tells you something. They're not desperate. They're confirming a plan before they execute it. Which means when they come, it won't be loud at first. Understood, Hale said. A pause. You sound like yourself again. Don't get used to it, Elena said, and ended the call before he could answer. At 11:20, she found a reason to check on Ray Doss directly. A blood pressure recheck, entirely legitimate, entirely unremarkable to anyone glancing at the chart. He was awake this time, watching the door the way he had watched it since intake, and when Elena drew the privacy curtain part way, something in his posture shifted, subtle but real. You're not just a nurse, he said quietly. Not a question. Vitals are stable, Elena said, cuff already wrapping his arm, voice pitched for anyone passing in the hallway. Then lower, barely a breath. I know what you did for the last 18 months. I know what it cost you this morning. I need you to trust that the people in this building right now are trying to keep you alive, including me. Ray's jaw tightened. They'll find me here. It's only a matter of time. I've seen how they work. I know, Elena said. I've seen it too, once, a different version of the same thing. She released the cuff, recorded numbers on the chart that meant nothing next to what they'd just said to each other. Rest. Let the people around you do their jobs. That includes me. She left before he could answer, drawing the curtain closed behind her, her face already rearranged into the calm, unremarkable expression of a nurse moving on to her next task. Down the hall, Priya waved her over, oblivious to everything. "Cross, can you help me with a line in bed 9? I keep missing the vein." "Of course," Elena said, and for the next 15 minutes she was entirely, genuinely present for a frightened teenager getting in 4, her hand steady, her voice gentle, the version of herself this hospital had known for 3 years fully intact, even as another version of herself ran calculations about gray sedans and reconnaissance patterns in the back of her mind. It was, she thought, the strangest kind of competence, holding 2 entire lives in the same body at the same time, letting neither one drop. She did not yet know how soon she would have to choose between them. The corridor outside the archive room ran red and dim under emergency lighting, and Elena moved through it the way she had once moved through hallways much like it in another life, close to the wall, weight forward, eyes constantly recalculating the angles of every doorway she passed. She found Hale's second man, the older one, crouched at the junction near radiology, weapon low, watching the stairwell door with the particular stillness of someone counting seconds since he'd last had eyes on a threat. "Where's the colonel?" she said, dropping beside him. "3rd floor, trying to get patients out of the pediatric ward before this gets worse. 2 hostiles confirmed near the loading dock. We lost visual on the other 2 after the lights went." His eyes flicked to her, uncertain of her role in all this, uncertain what to call a nurse who moved like she did. "Ma'am, this isn't—" "I know what this isn't," Elena said. "How many staff still unaccounted for on this floor?" "We don't know. Comms are spotty since the lights." She thought of Priya, last heard shouting for help near bed 12, swallowed somewhere in the confusion of an evacuation that had turned into something far worse than a fire drill. She thought of Dale at the front desk, who had no idea what was moving through his building. She thought of the elderly man in bed 6 and his daughter, and the dozens of other ordinary people who had walked into an emergency room today expecting nothing more dangerous than a long wait. "I'm going to clear the east corridor," Elena said. "Get people moving toward radiology, like the colonel wants. You hold this junction. Alone. I know this building," she said. "You don't. That's the whole advantage I have. Use it." She didn't wait for his agreement. She found Priya in a supply alcove off the main hallway, crouched behind a crash cart with 2 frightened patients and an elderly volunteer, all 3 of them white-faced in the red emergency light. "Cross." Priya's voice cracked with relief. "What is happening? Nobody will tell us anything. The lights went out and then someone said there were people with guns and—" "I need you to listen to me," Elena said, crouching level with her, voice deliberately calm, the same register she'd used on 100 frightened family members over 3 years, except now every word carried weight she couldn't fully explain. "There are armed individuals in this building. This is not a drill. I need you to take these 2 and get to radiology, 2nd floor, interior corridor, no windows. Move along the wall, stay low, and if you see anyone in dark clothing who isn't hospital staff, you go the other direction. Can you do that? What about you? I'm getting the rest of this floor moving the same way." Elena squeezed her shoulder once, a gesture that cost her more than Priya would ever know. The small human touch of someone she had spent 3 years protecting without ever telling her the truth of what she was protecting her from. "Go. Now." Priya went, shepherding the elderly volunteer and the 2 patients into the dim corridor with shaking hands and a steadiness in her voice that made something in Elena's chest ache with something close to pride. She kept moving. She found Arthur Kell's daughter in the stairwell landing, half dragging her father's wheelchair down a half-flight of steps meant for walking patients, both of them terrified and stuck. "I've got him," Elena said, taking the chair's handles, lifting with her legs and not her back the way she'd been trained decades ago in circumstances that had nothing to do with hospital wheelchairs. "Stay right behind me." They made it to the 2nd floor without incident, and Elena delivered them into the crowded, tense safety of the radiology corridor, where Hale's second man had begun organizing the growing cluster of evacuated staff and patients into something resembling order. It was there, turning back toward the stairwell to make one more pass for stragglers, that Elena heard it, a sound that didn't belong, boots on tile, moving with purpose, close. She had perhaps 2 seconds of warning. A man in dark clothing rounded the corner from the west corridor, weapon raised, moving fast toward the cluster of frightened people behind her. His eyes swept the group and settled, with cold professional focus, on the easiest path through them. Elena did not think. She moved. She stepped directly into his line, one hand closing over his wrist and forcing the weapon's angle upward and away from the crowd in a single fluid motion, her body already turning, using his own forward momentum against him. It was not the movement of a nurse. It was not the movement of anyone who had spent the last 3 years doing nothing more dangerous than lifting patients and drawing blood. The man was strong, trained, and surprise, for one critical half-second, was enough. She drove him off balance and into the wall, hard, the weapon clattering free and skidding across the tile. Behind her, someone screamed. She heard Priya's voice shouting her name, heard the scrape of chairs and gurneys as people scrambled back. The man recovered fast, swinging toward her with a fist that would have broken her jaw if it landed. It didn't land. She'd already moved, redirecting the strike, using his own weight to put him down against the wall a second time, harder, her forearm braced against his throat just long enough to still him. "Stop," she said, low and even, close to his ear. "Or I make sure you don't get up." He stopped. It took Hale's second man 4 more seconds to arrive, weapon-trained, and take over from there. Zip ties, a radio call, the mechanical aftermath of a threat neutralized. Elena stepped back, breathing hard, hands trembling faintly with the aftershock her training had taught her to expect and manage. The corridor had gone entirely silent except for the low hum of the emergency lights. Every face in that hallway, Priya's, Arthur Kell's daughters, the elderly volunteers, a dozen strangers she had spent 3 years quietly caring for, was turned toward her with the same expression. Shock, disbelief, the particular vertigo of watching someone you thought you knew do something that made no sense against everything you believed about them. "Cross," Priya said, very quietly, into the silence. "What was that? What are you?" Elena looked at her, and for one long, terrible moment, felt the full weight of what she was about to lose settle onto her chest like something physical. 3 years. A life built with painstaking care, brick by brick, precisely so that no one would ever look at her the way Priya was looking at her right now. It was gone. Whatever came after this, whatever explanation she gave or didn't give, the version of Elena Cross that this hospital had known, quiet and unremarkable and safely ordinary, was not coming back. She had known, somewhere in the archive room with Ray Doss, that this moment might come. She had chosen it anyway, the instant she chose to walk back out into a corridor full of people who needed her more than her old life needed protecting. That was the cost. She paid it without flinching, because the alternative, letting that weapon find the crowd behind her, letting Priya or Arthur Kell's daughter or any of the dozen strangers she'd spent 3 years quietly caring for become casualties of a fight that was never theirs, was not a cost she had ever been willing to consider. "Later," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I promise you an answer. Right now I need you to get everyone to radiology and stay there." Priya searched her face for a long moment, something working behind her eyes. Fear, still, but underneath it, something else. Trust, perhaps, choosing to hold on despite every reason not to. "Okay," Priya said finally, quietly. "Okay. Later." She turned and began moving the group forward, and Elena watched her go with an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the fight she'd just won. Her radio crackled. Hale's voice, urgent. "Cross, report. We heard shouting on this channel. 1 hostile down and secured. 2nd floor east corridor," Elena said. "Civilians safe. Moving to radiology. Colonel, I need to know how many are left, and I need to know now, because half this floor just watched me do something I can't take back." A pause, brief and heavy. 2 unaccounted for. Ray's still secure in the archive room, last check. "Copy," Elena said. "I'm going to finish clearing this corridor. Then I'm going to go get him myself." "Elena." Hale's voice softened, just slightly, just enough that she heard the man underneath the colonel. "You didn't have to do what you just did. Not like that, not in front of them." "Yes, I did," Elena said. "That's the whole point, Colonel. That's always been the point." She clipped the radio back to her hip, checked the corridor once more for stragglers, and moved on, carrying with her the particular aching weight of a life she had just spent to keep a hallway full of strangers alive, a cost she would not, given the same choice again, ever hesitate to pay twice. The archive room's bolt was still thrown when Elena reached it, which told her 2 things before she'd even knocked the pattern she and Ray had agreed on: 3 slow, 2 fast. It told her the room had held. It also told her that whoever the 2 remaining hostiles were, they hadn't found this corridor yet, or they'd have already tried the door. Ray opened it a half-inch, saw her face, and let her in. "Two left," Elena said, sliding the bolt back into place behind her. Buildings mostly cleared to radiology. Colonels coordinating from the 3rd floor. She crouched to check the gauze at his arm, more out of habit than necessity. His color was better than it had been an hour ago, his breathing steadier. "You're stable enough to move if we have to." "You didn't come back just to check my vitals," Ray said. "No." Elena sat back on her heels, weighing what she was about to say against the version of herself that had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of conversation. "I need to understand what Meridian actually wants from you. Not the file version. The real one. If I'm going to end this instead of just surviving it, I need to know what I'm ending." Ray was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. "There's a ledger," he said finally. "Financial records, 18 months of shipment data, names of people inside 3 different agencies who've been paid to look the other way. I memorized as much as I could before they caught on to me. That's what they wanted this morning. That's what they'll keep wanting, whether I live or die, because if I talk to the right people, it ends them completely." "Did you talk to anyone before you were dumped near that road?" "No," Ray said. "I didn't get the chance." Elena absorbed that. It reframed the entire shape of the threat. Meridian wasn't hunting Ray Doss to punish him for what he'd already done. They were hunting him to prevent what he hadn't done yet. Which meant every hour he stayed alive was an hour their exposure grew larger, and men in that position did not retreat quietly. They escalated, because retreat was no longer a survivable option for them either. "They're not going to stop at 2 men in a hospital," Elena said, half to herself. "If this ledger is what you're describing, they'll keep sending people until either you're dead or they are." "That's about the size of it," Ray said grimly. Elena's radio crackled, low and urgent. Hale's voice, tighter than before. "Cross. We have a problem. Security footage from the loading dock, before we lost the feed, shows the 2 remaining hostiles didn't head for the archive room. They're moving toward the pediatric ward." Elena went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the building's dimmed emergency lighting. "Pediatrics not near anything they'd want," she said. "There's no ledger there, no informant, nothing Meridian has any reason to touch." "I know," Hale said. "Which means this isn't about the ledger anymore. I think they know we've secured Ray. I think they're changing the equation, hurting people who have nothing to do with this until someone hands him over, or until we're forced to make a trade we can't walk back from." Elena closed her eyes for one brief second. Somewhere in that ward were children who had done nothing except be sick on the wrong day, in the wrong building, at the wrong time. The calculation she had spent her entire adult life training to make, mission versus civilians, asset versus innocence, collapsed instantly into something with only one possible answer. "I'm going," she said. "Elena, there is no version of this where I let 2 men threaten a children's ward while I stay here guarding a man who can defend himself with a locked door," Elena said, already moving, already checking the narrow secondary exit from the archive room. "Keep him secure. I'll handle the ward." "You're not armed," Hale said. "Not properly. My men are still 20 minutes out from full containment." "I don't need 20 minutes, Elena said. "I need 3. She didn't wait for his argument. She looked once more at Ray, who met her eyes with the steady, grateful weight of a man who understood exactly what she was choosing and why. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll be here." The pediatric ward sat at the end of the 3rd-floor corridor, behind double doors decorated with hand-painted clouds that some long-ago volunteer had added to make the space feel less frightening for children who were, more often than not, already frightened enough. Elena reached the corridor's mouth and stopped, pressing herself against the wall, listening. Voices, low, controlled. A child crying, muffled, the sound of someone trying and failing to be quiet about their fear. And beneath it, footsteps, 2 sets, moving with the unhurried, confident pace of men who believed they had already won. Elena thought fast. A direct confrontation in a hallway full of children's rooms risked exactly the kind of chaos that got people hurt. Panicked staff, frightened kids, gunfire in a space with nowhere to take proper cover. She needed something else. Something quieter. She found it in the housekeeping closet 3 doors down. Not a weapon in any conventional sense, but a fire extinguisher, heavy, solid, entirely unremarkable for a nurse to be carrying through her own hospital. She approached the ward doors from the blind angle, the one that put her outside the sightline of the small reinforced window, and listened again. One voice, closer now, speaking to someone, a nurse, Elena realized, her heart tightening at the sound of the woman's shaking voice trying to negotiate, trying to buy time for children who couldn't run anywhere on their own. "Don't have what you're looking for, there's nobody here who—" "We're not asking twice," a man's voice said, flat, cold. Elena pushed the door open. The room registered in a single sweep, 6 children's beds, most occupied, a terrified young nurse standing between 2 men in dark clothing and a toddler's crib, her arms spread as if her body alone could stop what was coming. The nearer of the 2 men turned toward the sound of the door. Weapon already lifting. Elena didn't give him the half-second he needed to aim. She closed the distance in 3 fast steps and swung the extinguisher in a short, brutal arc that caught his forearm and sent the weapon spinning across the floor. His shout of pain swallowed by the room's sudden chaos. A child screaming, the nurse dropping to shield the crib, monitors beginning to alarm from the sudden noise and movement. The second man spun toward her, faster than his partner, already reaching for something at his hip. Elena didn't wait. She drove forward inside his reach, using the extinguisher's mass as an extension of her own arm, catching him hard across the ribs before he could bring his weapon fully to bear. He staggered back into an empty crib, and Elena pressed the advantage, pinning his weapon arm against the crib's rail with her forearm and driving her weight down until something in his shoulder gave with a sound she felt more than heard. He went down. She kicked the weapon away and turned, extinguisher already rising again, toward the first man, who had recovered his balance and was reaching, with his uninjured hand, for a second weapon at his belt. "Don't," Elena said. Her voice was quiet. It was not a threat delivered with heat or volume. It was simply, flatly, a statement of fact, the voice of someone who had already calculated exactly what would happen next if he continued that motion, and was giving him one chance to choose differently. He looked at her, really looked, the way Hale had looked at her that morning in the consultation room, recalibrating everything he'd assumed about the nurse who'd just disarmed his partner in under 10 seconds, and something in her stillness made him stop. His hand moved away from his belt, slowly. "Sit down," Elena said. "Hands where I can see them." He sat. Elena kept the extinguisher raised, her breathing controlled, her eyes never leaving him, until the sound of boots in the corridor announced Hale's men arriving. Proper restraints, proper procedure, the mechanical cleanup of a threat that had, for one suspended, terrible minute, held 6 children's lives in the balance. Only when the second man was secured did Elena let the extinguisher's weight drop to the floor, her arms trembling now with an aftershock that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with what she had just come within a half-second of losing. The young nurse was still crouched by the crib, sobbing quietly, cradling the toddler against her chest. Elena crossed to her and knelt down, her voice dropping into the same gentle register she'd used with 100 frightened families over 3 years, the register that had never, until this moment, needed to coexist with what she'd just done 30 seconds earlier. "You're safe," Elena said. "It's over. You did exactly right, protecting her. You did exactly right." The nurse looked up at her, tear-streaked, uncomprehending. "Who are you?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room, the children now beginning to be tended by arriving staff, the 2 restrained men being led out under guard, Hale himself now standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm the nurse who's worked this floor for 3 years, Elena said finally, quiet and even. That part was never a lie. Hale found her 20 minutes later in the stairwell, alone, sitting on the concrete steps with her elbows on her knees, the adrenaline finally beginning to drain out of her system in the particular, hollow way it always had, even years ago, in situations far more dangerous than this one. Both hostels secured. Ray's being moved to a secure facility within the hour, he said, sitting down a step below her, his voice quieter than she'd heard it all day. Buildings clear. My team's helping coordinate with local police on a cover story that'll keep most of this out of the news. Most of it, Elena said. There were 40 witnesses in that corridor, Elena, and a room full of parents whose children just watched a nurse take down 2 armed men with a fire extinguisher. Hale's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. I can manage the official record. I can't manage what your colleagues saw with their own eyes. Elena said nothing for a long moment, staring at the stairwell's gray concrete, feeling the full weight of the day settle onto her at last. I know, she said finally. For what it's worth, Hale said, what you did today, the restraint, the way you handled that ward without firing a single shot in a room full of children, That's not. By early evening, Riverside General had settled into the strange, muted quiet that follows a crisis. Not the ordinary quiet of a slow shift, but something heavier, full of people moving carefully around each other, unsure yet how to speak about what they'd witnessed. Elena changed out of her scrubs in the staff locker room, alone, the fabric still faintly marked with dust from the stairwell concrete. Her hands, she noticed, had finally stopped trembling. She stood for a moment in front of the small mirror bolted above the sinks, looking at her own reflection the way a stranger might, trying to see what Priya had seen, what the young nurse in the pediatric ward had seen, what 40 witnesses in that second-floor corridor now carried with them as their new understanding of who Elena Cross actually was. She didn't have an answer for the mirror. She wasn't sure she had one for anyone yet. Colonel Hale found her an hour later in the small break room, empty except for the two of them, a pot of coffee gone cold on the counter. "Ray's secure," he said, sitting across from her. "Full medical transfer, proper security detail this time. He'll live to hand over that ledger, and when he does, it's going to end a great many careers that deserve to be ended." He paused. "He asked me to tell you something before he left." "What?" he said. "Tell her I know exactly what it cost her to walk back into that hallway, and I won't forget it." Hale's mouth softened, just slightly. For a man who spent 18 months undercover surrounded by people who wanted him dead, that's about as sincere as it gets. Elena nodded slowly, turning her cold coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "And the two men from the pediatric ward? In federal custody. They'll talk, eventually. Most of them do, once they understand how deep the exposure runs." Hale studied her for a moment. "You're going to be asked questions, Elena. By the hospital, probably by police liaisons managing the cover story, maybe eventually by people above my pay grade who are curious how a Riverside General night nurse ended up disarming 2 Meridian operatives in a room full of children." "What do I tell them?" "As little as the truth requires," Hale said. "I've already filed a report that credits emergency response training and, frankly, remarkable composure under pressure. It's not entirely a lie. You are a nurse. You did respond to an emergency. I just left out the parts that would follow you around for the rest of your life if they became public." He hesitated. "The offer still stands, by the way. Reinstatement. A different program, less exposure, work that would use what you clearly haven't lost. You'd be good at it. You already proved that today." Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking past him toward the window, where the parking lot lights had begun to flicker on against the coming dusk. "No," she said finally. "I appreciate it, Colonel. I mean that. But I built this life on purpose. I'm not walking away from it because one bad day reminded me I still know how to do the other thing." Hale nodded slowly, as though he'd expected exactly that answer and had asked anyway out of some obligation to try. "Then I'll make sure the paper trail protects it. As much as I can." He stood, extending a hand. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, this hospital has no idea how lucky it's been for 3 years." Elena shook his hand, something in her chest loosening slightly at the old, familiar formality of the gesture. "Take care of Ray." "I will." He left without further ceremony, the particular economy of a man who had learned long ago not to draw out goodbyes. Elena sat alone in the break room a while longer, listening to the hospital slowly reassemble itself beyond the door. She found Priya near the nurses' station just before the end of the evening shift, restocking a tray with hands that were still, faintly, unsteady. "Hey," Elena said quietly. Priya looked up, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the afternoon sitting between them in a way that made ordinary words feel inadequate. "You said later," Priya said finally. "Is this later?" "As much later as I can give you today," Elena said. She chose her words carefully, aware that whatever she said now would become the story Priya carried about her for the rest of their working relationship, if there still was one. "Before this job, I served. Something specialized, the kind of thing that doesn't come with a tidy job title. I left it behind on purpose a few years ago because I wanted a life that looked like this one, quiet, useful, mine. Today the old life found me for a few hours. I did what I had to do to keep it from hurting people I care about. Then I put it back where it belongs." Priya absorbed that, her expression moving through several things at once. Fear, still lingering, but also something like understanding. The kids in that ward. My friend Talia works pediatrics. She said you just walked in and it was over in like 10 seconds. She said you didn't even look scared. I was terrified, Elena said honestly. I was just trained a long time ago not to let it show while there's still a job to do. Are you going to leave? Priya asked, quieter now. Now that everyone knows. Elena considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. I don't know everyone's going to make of what they saw today. Some people might be uneasy around me for a while. That's fair. I surprised them, and surprise is unsettling. She met Priya's eyes steadily. But I'm not leaving unless this hospital doesn't want me anymore. This is still the life I chose. Today didn't change that. If anything, it reminded me why I chose it. Priya was quiet for a moment, then, slowly, something in her shoulders relaxed. For what it's worth, she said, Talia said one of the moms in that ward wants to know your name. Not Nurse Cross. Your actual first name. She wants to write you a thank you card or something. Elena felt something unexpected move through her chest. Not the cold, clean satisfaction of a mission completed, but something warmer and far more vulnerable. Tell her that's kind, but I'd rather she just hug her kid a little tighter tonight. That's thanks enough. Priya smiled, small and tired but genuine. That's very you know that? I hope so, Elena said quietly. I'd like it to stay that way. Grantfeld cornered her near the end of the shift, clipboard in hand as always, his usual bureaucratic irritation tempered, for once, by something like genuine unease. I've had 3 separate federal officials in my office today, he said. I've been told, in no uncertain terms, that most of what happened this afternoon is now classified in some fashion I don't fully understand, and that I should be, quote, grateful for your quick thinking during a security incident. He studied her with new, uncertain eyes. Is there anything you want to tell me, Cross? Only that I'm glad everyone's safe, Elena said evenly. And that I'd like to keep doing my job here, if that's all right with you. Feld looked at her for a long moment, the particular disorientation of a man who had spent 3 years filing her away as unremarkable and was now being forced, publicly and completely, to revise that assessment. I don't fully understand what happened today, he said finally. But I'd be a fool to let a nurse who single-handedly de-escalated an active threat walk out of my emergency department over a staffing decision. A pause. Take tomorrow off, Cross. That's not a request. Understood, Elena said. He walked away, still visibly unsettled, and Elena allowed herself, for just a moment, something close to a genuine smile. She left the hospital at 8:30 p.m., the parking lot lit gold under the last of the evening sun, the gray sedans and dark SUVs long since gone, the loading dock's false delivery van towed away hours ago by a cleanup crew that had left no trace of the day's violence behind. Riverside General stood exactly as it always had, ordinary, unremarkable from the outside, a building full of people quietly doing difficult work without expecting recognition for it. Elena stood at her car for a long moment, looking back at it, feeling the particular aching gratitude of someone who had nearly lost something and had, against real odds, managed to keep it. She had not chosen this life by accident. She had built it, deliberately, brick by careful brick, because after everything she had done and seen and paid for in another uniform, this was the version of service she had wanted for herself. Quiet, unglamorous, measured in single lives steadied one at a time rather than missions completed and forgotten. Today had cracked the careful anonymity she'd spent 3 years maintaining. It had not broken the life underneath it. Tomorrow, she understood, would require its own kind of quiet courage. Walking back onto that floor, meeting the eyes of people who now knew something true about her they hadn't known yesterday, and choosing, deliberately, to remain exactly who she had always been to them regardless of what else she also was. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove home under a sky just beginning to darken, carrying with her both versions of herself at once, the way she always had, and, for the first time in a long while, no longer entirely alone in the carrying. 3 weeks later, Riverside General had mostly returned to the rhythm it had always kept, the low hum of monitors, the shuffle of shift changes, the particular tiredness that settled over a night floor sometime after 3 a.m. and never fully lifted until dawn. Elena worked her shifts the way she always had. She restocked supply carts, checked exits out of habit rather than necessity now, drew blood, calmed frightened families, and moved through the department with the same unhurried competence she'd carried for 3 years before a colonel in a gray suit had walked through her front doors and rearranged everything she thought she'd built. Some things had changed, quietly, in ways that didn't make headlines or hospital newsletters. A few nurses on the day shift still glanced at her a beat too long when her name came up in handoff. Dale, the security guard, had started nodding to her with a new kind of seriousness each morning, as though he'd finally understood what his job actually required and felt, faintly, embarrassed about the phone he used to spend his mornings on. Grant Feld had stopped making idle comments about her efficiency, and instead simply left her alone to do her work, which she understood, from a man like him, was its own form of respect. Priya had not pulled away, as Elena had feared she might. If anything, something steadier had grown between them, not a friendship built on secrets shared, but one built on Priya's quiet decision, made somewhere in the days after the incident, to trust the whole of who Elena was rather than just the comfortable, familiar part of her. "You're still the same at the bedside," Priya had told her once, a week after, both of them restocking trays at 2 a.m., "I watched for it. I kept waiting for you to be different with patients, colder or something. You're not. If anything, you're gentler than before." "I've always been gentler when I have a choice about it," Elena had said, and left it there, and Priya had let her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered not through the hospital's mail system but hand-carried by a courier who asked for her by name at the staff entrance and left before she could ask any questions. Inside was a single page, unsigned except for a familiar, economical hand at the bottom. "Ledger's done its work. 14 arrests so far, more coming. You should know your restraint that day. The choice not to escalate, not to let a firefight happen in a hospital full of people, is the reason this stayed containable instead of becoming a story neither of us could have controlled. The offer remains open, whenever or if ever you want it. No pressure attached. Just wanted you to know it mattered." Elena read it twice in the quiet of the staff break room, then folded it carefully and slid it into her locker, beneath a spare pair of shoes, where it would stay unless she needed, on some future difficult night, to remember that the version of herself she'd set aside had done some good on its way out the door. She did not write back. Some doors were better left held slightly open than fully closed, acknowledged, respected, and left alone. On a quiet Thursday evening, near the end of a slow shift, Elena found herself back at bed 6, though the patient there now was an entirely different elderly man with an entirely different worried daughter. She took his vitals with the same unhurried care she always had, answered the daughter's anxious questions without checking the clock, and left the room feeling the particular, ordinary satisfaction that had first drawn her to this work. Not adrenaline, not mission completion, just one frightened family made slightly less frightened because someone had taken the time to sit with them for 5 unhurried minutes. Walking back toward the nurse's station, she passed the ambulance bay window, and out of habit, the old habit, the one 3 weeks of stillness hadn't erased and probably never fully would, she glanced out at the parking lot. Rain again, fine and steady under the security lights. Nothing moved out there except the rain itself. She stood a moment longer than the task required, the way she always had, watching an empty lot as though it might, on some future ordinary night, stop being empty. It didn't, tonight. It was, simply, an empty lot in the rain, outside a hospital full of people quietly doing difficult work. Elena allowed herself something rare. Not relief exactly, because relief implied the vigilance would ever fully end, and she'd long since made peace with the fact that it wouldn't. It was something quieter than relief. A kind of settledness. The understanding that she had, in the space of one impossible day, been asked to choose between 2 versions of her life, and had chosen, not by abandoning either one, but by letting